Let me welcome you here on behalf of Lee Hamilton, the president of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and Howard Wolpe, who is the director of the Africa and Leadership Programs and cannot be with us today because he's traveling. I'm Steve McDonald, the consulting program associate for the Africa and Leadership Programs here at the center. Do most of our field work out in the African continent, including in Liberia, where I've spent a good deal of time myself. We're very, very happy to be able to co-host this event this afternoon with the Open Society Institute. Let me begin by giving you just a note of explanation for those of you who don't know about the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Open Society Institute, who are co-sponsoring today. The Wilson Center was established by an act of Congress in 1968 and is the nation's official living memorial to Woodrow Wilson, who was, as you probably know, the only American president with a doctorate. A very distinguished scholar, and felt very strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise and aiming to bridge the gap between the world of ideas and the world of policy. The Wilson Center, established in his name, is a nonpartisan institute for the advanced study and a neutral forum for open, serious, and informal dialogue, some of which I'm pretty sure will take place today. The Open Society Institute, as you probably all know, is a private operating and grant-making foundation which aims to shape public policy to promote democratic governance, human rights, and economic and legal and social reform. We are very happy to be able to host this event today with this distinguished panel, who I will introduce in just a moment. But first, just a couple of remarks as a scene setter on Liberia. Most of you, I know, are pretty well informed on the events there. You know that it's one of the most traumatized nations in Africa. It's just come out of 14 years of civil war that has seen the death of over 250,000 people and the dislocation of 500,000 more. 1/3 of its population has been internally displaced or forced to become refugees. There's a large population of frustrated youth, compounded by the fact that many of them are ex-combatants. There are a variety of factors that underlie the Liberian state collapse, but none are more significant than the decades of corrupt and predatory governance, combined with a massive historic disparity between a privileged elite and an impoverished population. The UN Country Report for 2004, written after the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in Accra, estimated that the Liberian GDP averaged $158 per annum, less than 50% of its pre-war levels. The national debt was at an unsustainable $2.8 billion US dollars, and extreme poverty rates were respectively 76.2% and 52%. The Human Development Index ranked Liberia second to last among 174 countries. Civil war and government mismanagement have destroyed much of Liberia's economy, especially the infrastructure in and around Liberia and the road network around the country. Liberia has been, in the past, a producer and exporter of basic products, mostly raw timber and rubber. It's richly endowed with water, mineral resources, forests, and a climate favorable to agriculture. It has begun to receive, since the election in late 2005, which brought a new government into being in January of 2006 this year, it's begun to receive aid and resource flows. Just this month, a $3.7 million agreement was signed for the building of 3 major road systems throughout the country, signed with the World Bank and the United Nations. Some electrification rehabilitation has begun, mostly within the capital, not outside yet, with the signing of the Governance and Economic Management Plan, Action Plan, GMAP, in 2005. There's great hope that transparent revenue collection and allocation will accompany the reestablishment of governance, democratic governments, because reconstruction of the infrastructure and the raising of incomes in this ravaged economy will largely depend upon generous financial support from donor countries. These are hopeful signs. The President is a knowledgeable and committed development specialist and has indicated a sensitivity to the need to restore trust and cohesion, as well as garner the resources so critical to any economic recovery. On my last trip out there with the Woodrow Wilson Center earlier this year, we conducted a workshop on national reconciliation and collaboration with a broad range of leaders from inside and outside of government. And the President was fully supportive of that, understanding the sensitivity of the need to reestablish relationships, trust, and collaborative decision-making. But the process of rebuilding the economic and social structure of this war-torn country remains sluggish, as the core causes of the conflict remain unaddressed. A massive inequality in resource distribution throughout the country, ethnic and regional conflicts that have not been addressed, a continuing winner-take-all mentality among the elites, both present and former, the continuing uneasiness caused by former combatants, unemployed youth, and a growing urban criminal element, and a Mono River Basin region still rife with conflict that can easily overflow into the Liberian realm again. Much work lies ahead for President Johnson's Sirleaf. One critical issue that will impact the recovery is the revenue and fair distribution of that revenue from diamond and timber exports currently sanctioned by the United Nations. Without a lifting of these sanctions, many people feel there will be severe limits on growth prospects for the foreseeable future. It is this issue that the UN panel of experts on Liberia, who you see some of the members before you today, have been examining, and which will be the focus of our discussions today. The UN panel was brought into existence in September 2003, or had a renewed mandate in 2003 under the Security Council Resolution 1521 to do an assessment mission to Liberia and neighboring states on the implementation and violations of sanctions. The panel reports directly to the Sanctions Committee of the Security Council of the United Nations. They were conducting hearings last week, and again on the 13th, Wednesday of this week, they will be conducting hearings in New York. The members of the panel that we have before us today are Art Blundell to my left, Tim Hetherington to my left, and Casper Fiffen, who is all the way at the right side there. We also have with us Steve Ratelet. We are going to speak in the order that I've just indicated. Each person will take about 5 to 8 minutes or so, because we want this to be an open discussion on this issue. Art will lead off. He is a timber specialist, and he chairs the UN panel. He's got a PhD from Dartmouth, has worked with USAID and USAID and EPA here in Washington, and has been in Liberia since 2003 as the chair of the UN panel. He will be followed by Tim Hetherington, who is a consultant to the panel. He has just returned from Liberia to report to the UN, and for the past 7 years, Tim has worked as a photographer and filmmaker in West Africa, and you're seeing the results of some of his work as you were walking into the room. He has spent the last 4 years focused entirely on Liberia. He has had further experience in the region, including extensive periods of time in Sierra Leone, and made a film this year about oil and corruption in the Niger Delta. Casper will then follow. He's a diamond specialist. He has a PhD from UCLA, where he looked at the relationship between diamonds and conflict. He has worked at the International Policy Institute in London, has been involved in the region in West Africa since 1992 as a political anthropologist, and has been in Liberia as well since 2003 with the UN panel. They are going to talk about the work of the panel from their various special interests and perspectives. And then we're going to ask Steve to make some comments in response. Steve is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, where he works on issues related to foreign aid, development, developing country debt, economic growth, and trade between rich and poor countries. He was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury for Africa, the Middle East, and Asia from January 2000 through June 2002. He was before that on the faculty at Harvard University, where he was a fellow at the Harvard Institute for International Development, director of the Institute's macroeconomics programs, and a lecturer on economics and public policy. More pertinent to us today is he's currently serving as an economic advisor to the President of Liberia and to the Minister of Finance of Liberia. This is a project that is initiated by the OSI. And he will be in a good position to bring us a good economic overview and a view from inside the President's office on this really important issue about economic sanctions. With that very brief introduction, Al, let me turn it over to you. Art.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak here, and thanks everyone for coming to listen to us today. I'm going to talk very briefly about how Liberia got to a position where they were sanctioned by the UN. and then turn it over to Tim to talk a bit more about current patterns that you see there. Just so everybody's on the same page, you'll remember that Liberia is in West Africa, down here between Sierra Leone and Ivory Coast. And you'll remember that there's a close link to the United States. And that's because although Liberia is one of only 2 countries in Africa that was never colonized, in fact, it was colonized of a sort because Americans went to Liberia. Ex-slaves were repatriated, even though they weren't necessarily from the area. And they first arrived in 1816, and by 1841 they'd founded their independent country. These Americo-Liberians, as they're called, have never made up more than about 5% of the population of the country. But they have a very strong, this is the privileged elite that was referred to in the introduction. And that history plays a very important part in how the distribution of resources occurs in Liberia, and also the development of grievance, especially among the ethnic Liberians, those people that don't have an American background. And what you saw was that grievance boiling over in 1980 in the coup of Sam Doe, and his government, which is really a kleptocracy, it was no better than what he replaced, which led to a civil war in 1989 that brought Charles Taylor's first foray back into Liberia. And in 92, the UN first sanctioned Liberia to stop the flow of weapons coming into Liberia to fund this civil war that was going on. You'll remember that the Civil War sort of went back and forth. In 97, there was an election that Taylor won, apparently free and fairly. And so he set up his presidency. And from that point, things got a little hairy for him because he started adventures into other countries, not just Liberia. And the Security Council again sanctioned Charles Taylor, especially diamonds, because of his trying to get hold of the diamond mining areas and support of the RUF rebels in Sierra Leone to get hold of the diamond mining areas and control that flow. And that's not really referred to in the movie Blood Diamonds that's out right now, but it's that same conflict. So you have Taylor being sanctioned at that point on diamonds and the weapons coming into Liberia. The interesting thing was the Security Council didn't sanction anyone else. They didn't sanction other parties that then came back into Liberia, the lurid rebels that started another war within Liberia. And what you saw was that Charles Taylor, when he first came in 89, he quickly tried to get control of as many resource areas that he could, especially the mining area in Nimba County. And at one time, even though he wasn't president of Liberia in the mid-90s, he was controlling about $10 million of revenue a month, just in the money coming from the mining in particular, because the Nimba mine was so huge, but also diamonds, gold, timber, rubber, and other rents that he was able to derive from those operations that were ongoing. Ironically, when he became president, his ability to get that money actually had declined because the mine had been destroyed during the war, because so much of the infrastructure had been destroyed during the war. The sanctions had come on diamonds. So what he was left with was really timber in terms of resources that he could extract from Liberia itself. He was getting money through the shipping registry. You might notice how ships around the world are registered. Many are registered in Liberia, even though they've got no connection to Liberia at all. These sort of flags of convenience. Every year, that was worth about $20 million to the Liberian government, of which Taylor had control. But in terms of timber, what you saw was that he ran a system where he the balkanization of Liberia, if you will, where he had different timber companies controlling different parts of Liberia, and each company had their own militia group that was ostensibly to provide security for the logging company. But in fact, what it was doing was it was giving him, Charles Taylor, the ability to make sure that the rent was coming, the money was coming, because the militias would help make sure that the timber company had access to forest. Maybe they didn't even have the legal access to, but through the power of the gun, they had access to forest. It also kept the timber company itself loyal, because they couldn't really go against the militia. And it facilitated the movement of guns throughout the country. And you saw in the south, down the bottom, Harper here, there was a Maryland wood products industry run by Abbas Fawaz. And there, their militia group in May 2003, when the war heated up again, they massacred 200 people that we found. The UN has gone in and found the mass grave of local people who are trying to stop the logging militia from actually going into Ivory Coast to loot their fellow kin in Ivory Coast. When they tried to stop the militias going in, they were murdered. This is the sort of thing that the logging companies were doing. There was another inland logging company out of Greenville, where there was a militia leader that was operating the logging company. And in Buchanan, probably the most infamous, if you will, the Oriental Timber Company, which is actually an Indonesian company operating out of Liberia. Their president, who Charles Taylor had appointed, Gus Cohenhoven, was just indicted and found guilty of violating the arms embargo and sentenced to 8 years in The Hague. That was just last March. So this was the sort of background that was operating, where you had a legitimate president, but maintaining a sort of informal, illegal logging network throughout the country. And in fact, when the timber sanctions came on and Taylor left, and the UN and the international community was able to look at what was going on with the timber companies, because just as sort of background, after Taylor left and you had the UN there, the SRSG and in fact the U.S. ambassador both wanted just all the timber concessions canceled. They said, let's just start again. Taylor's gone, cancel all the concessions. My point was, no, you can't do that, because if there's ever a time to start following rule of law, it's now. And what does the law say? Their contracts. The contracts say that there's an arbitration procedure. Well, let's just actually play it out and see what happens if we look at what those timber companies and how they're operating. So the first thing we did was set up, well, what are the criteria that should allow for a timber company to be able to keep operating? And this is something that Jim Rocco, actually down the front here, did, a lawyer that was out there with the World Bank. It was, what are the bare minimum legal standards? Well, they must have a legal contract that was ratified by the legislature. They must have a business license. They must have articles of incorporation, and they must have posted a performance bond. Now, of the 70 companies that were operating in Liberia, who wants to hazard a guess how many could meet that minimum requirement? Absolutely right. This was the environment that people were operating under. This was business as usual. And in fact, if you map out those concessions and you look to see how much area were in concession, it was 2.5 times the area of forest. And that's because of overlapping concessions. And that goes back actually not just to Charles Taylor, but every single administration. They used this as a patronage opportunity where they would pay off the people that put them where they are. And now this is what we're trying to break. And this is what the Security Council, in their wisdom, decided to put sanctions on Liberia and not allow those timber sanctions to be lifted until the system was in place that we couldn't go back to business as usual. And just very briefly, because I've probably taken up my time already, but what that business as usual, to break that, what I said was, I'm not going to tell Liberia what to do, but I can tell you that whatever it is, it has to look like good governance. So it has to be transparent, it has to be effective, it has to be participatory, it has to be equitable, there has to be rule of law. Whatever you choose, that's what it has to look like. And so what we're in a process now is the Liberian government, with a lot of international help, a lot of it from the United States, actually, the U.S. Forest Service and USAID and the U.S. State Department, are trying to help the Liberians devise what that looks like, what good governance in the forest sector looks like. And that's the challenge, and we're not there by any means, but that's the future. And I've probably taken up enough of my time now, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the end about that.
We'll come to the questions at the end. Steve?
Picking
Pardon me?
Picking up where Art left off, talking about the sort of timber militias. Taylor also did that because it allowed him to bypass. I mean, he basically dissolved the power of the AFL, the Armed Forces of Liberia, and so he set up through having these logging militias a way of having militia power which was regionalized, different areas of the country, each with a commander overlooking a militia, which was controlling one particular resource area. And each of the commanders only answered directly to the head of that militia and then to Taylor. So if you were a head of another logging militia in another part and you went to, down to near Harper, the troops there wouldn't obey you. So there's a way that Taylor avoided anybody getting too powerful or trying to overthrow him, and this divide and rule. And what's interesting is that on the work that we've been doing recently on the panel, and is that this sort of idea of economic criminality has been one of the themes that we've been investigating. And what was interesting is that in rebuilding Liberia, there's been so much emphasis on Monrovia, both by international forces and by also UNMIL, is that it's left large swathes of the countryside partly up for grabs. And one of the reasons was that we found that in the sanctions regime, a lot of the emphasis went on looking at MPP structures, National Patriotic Party structures, Taylor's political capital, and and that sanctions in particular attacked these structures. So, for example, Oscar Cooper, of the Inland Logging Company, he was under scrutiny, and effectively he was shut down, which is great. And all of Taylor's associates were closed down, or have been attempted to close them down. But under the NTGL, there was a sort of agreement that, okay, we're going to, for inclusiveness, we're going to allow all the different rebel factions and everybody who has a stake in this country to come together and form the government. And whilst, on the one hand, sanctions focused on individuals under basically MPP individuals, it only took a very cursory view at people in the other militias. And for myself, I had a very inside view on this. I was one of the only, myself and a colleague were the only people to live with the Lur during their fight in the bush when they came to attack Monrovia. And it was interesting afterwards because, given this vantage point, I knew a lot of people who were on the other side of the fence, anti-Taylorites. And what was interesting was seeing the breakup of power under the NTGL. Now, if we take the example of the port, the National Ports Authority under the NTGL was basically, there was a shifting round of power, but eventually Joe Barler, who was a ULM-OJ, a high-up-ranking person from ULM-OJ, and then Secretary General of the LURD, ended up heading the port. And then Afore Deer, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the LURD, ended up running security at the port. And then Pei Dowie Jr., who was a senior Model commander, ended up as deputy head of the port. And so this sort of, and this happened this was replicated across all the ministries. So whilst we are focusing on Taylor so much, we've allowed a system of patronage to continue. The sort of patronage system that Taylor had developed himself was just shifted, and it shifted over in the NTGL. And what's happened also with the end of that NTGL and the coming of Ellen's Parliament is, again, as I said, as the focus has been on Monrovia and on bringing the country together, that these loose economic criminal networks have slipped and are moving, free-flowing into different parts of the country. So if you let's take, for example, a very interesting point is about Model, or ULM-OJ. There was a lot of emphasis on the war about the LURD fighting. The LURD basically did most of the ground fighting against Taylor to put the pressure on him leaving. But the fact was that ULM-OJ commanders played a large role in LURD in terms of the political hierarchy. They didn't. Mostly, it was Mandingo, ULM-OK people fighting on the ground, but it was ULM-OJ commanders who were also in the political hierarchy, who would hang out with Sekou Kane in Conakry. And at the same time, ULM-OJ people also were totally involved in Model. So, of course, when the NTGL dice were thrown and the country was divided up, those people, ULM-OJ people, did very well across the board. They got part of what was given to LURD, and they got what was given to Model. And if you take now, I'm just pulling out an example about showing how these economic criminal structures still exist. If you take now Sino Rubber Plantation. Sino Rubber Plantation was operated by a number of individuals, one guy called Kiafali, who was on the travel ban list, but it was also operated by a guy called Paulson Gate, and in the end, most predominantly by Paulson Gate. Paulson happened to be in prison with Joe Barler, and with a number of other individuals from ULMOJ under Taylor in '98, when there was the sort of the fight between Taylor and the ULMOJ after the end of the Civil War. So they spend time in prison together. Eventually Paulson gets out. He goes off to Ivory Coast, and eventually he leaves Ivory Coast, comes back to sign a rubber plantation, where he's involved in money making there. Now, when the UN and the government decided that he was causing too much trouble down there, they tried to arrest him. They did arrest him, brought him back with his colleague Bulo Sigia to Monrovia, and eventually, through the problems of the judicial system, he was given bail and he escaped and went to Ivory Coast with 20 of his friends. So what I'm trying to show you there is that the Sinai rubber plantation acted as an economic magnet for Model rebels. It's people like Guthrie rubber plantation by Monrovia was run by a guy called Sumo Dennis, who was a ULMOJ but lured commander. In fact, the very fact that rubber wasn't on the sanction list, on a timber sanction list, it acted as an economic magnet during the NTGL, and and a lot of the problems in economic criminality has come from this. And if you look down the border, what you see is that rubber out of Kavala, everything goes into Ivory Coast, and that there's the economic links of groups, say to Model to Lima Force in Ivory Coast. There are very strong interdependent links there. So this was of particular interest to us in examining this, and we felt that that also the situation on Ivory Coast does bear a strong threat to stability in Liberia because these sort of economic relationships between the two countries. And I'll just end up talking about BOPC, which is a diamond mine. Again, BOPC, the rule of law of Ellen's government hasn't moved into BOPC yet. It's a very remote place in Sino County. And yet, BOPC was, Mandingo camp there was set up by Sia Sharif, who was the chief of staff of the LERD. So whilst it is of great value that sanctions targeted the MPP structures, I think that the inability of sanctions to or effectively target other members of other rebel groups has had well, it's not been such a good thing for Liberia, and we watch with keen interest to see what will happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Dean.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to continue on from Tim and just talk to you a bit about the diamond sector in Liberia and the work that we've been doing on that. I began in May 2003. This is while Taylor was still sort of gripping onto what was left of his power in Monrovia. And we were looking at the time, trying to think about how we could actually interdict illegal shipments out of Liberia through Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, and Guinea. And it became very, very difficult to actually do that. It became clear, given the resources and the capacity that we had from pretty much from day one, that it was actually going to be very unlikely that we were going to be busting people around the border with pocketfuls of diamonds. As I'm sure most of you are aware, the area is very, very remote indeed. And we were using helicopters initially to try and figure out exactly where most of the diamond mines were in Liberia, because until that particular point in time, it was still unclear as to which areas were being exploited. So if I can just point on the map, there are three key areas. Okay, let me do it from here. There's an area here which is at the top of the Lofa River, which is broadly Lofa County and Bopoli County. And the Lofa River sort of runs down like this towards Robertsport, and there's quite a lot of mining all the way down the river. Can you all see that? There's another area here, which is in Nimba County, which is not along rivers, but actually on mountainsides. And there's a third area down here by Greenville, which is the BOPC area that Tim was just talking about now. Now, the price per carat, the average up here is probably around about sort of 120, 130. Round here, it's probably about 90. And down here, it's very poor quality production. It's what we call near gem industrial. It's between sort of $15, $25 a carat. So nothing particularly to write home about. In total, we estimate that at the moment, illegal production in Liberia, and there is production going on, which the UN is not mandated to actually stop, and the government obviously lacks the capacity to stop it. We think production is round about the sort of 12 to kind of anywhere between $10 and $15 million a year. which may sound like a lot of money, but neighbouring Sierra Leone is producing about $250 million worth of diamonds a year. So that gives you some idea of the kind of degrees of scale. And as I was saying, we spent most of 2003 just logging illegal mining sites with a view actually to working towards sector reform when there was a degree of stability in country after the arrival of the UN mission. It was problematic from the beginning because there was very little funding, and it took time underneath the NTGL to decide where the money was going to come from, how much it was the job was going to require, and who was actually going to manage the money. And as you can imagine, there was a certain degree of skepticism about the NTGL's intentions, and also their ability to handle significant amounts of money for these kinds of projects. It ticked along without very much kind of development until early 2005, when there was an event which is subsequently now known as the WAMCO scandal. WAMCO was a company called the West African Mining Corporation, which arrived, unbeknownst to just about everybody else in country, to do a deal with the government, with the Ministry of Lands, Mines and Energy, setting up what was essentially an exclusive purchasing arrangement for all minerals, in particular diamonds, in 2/3 of the whole of the country. This, under the legal terms of the document, it would have enabled the company to actually use diggers essentially as slaves, and gave WAMCO the power to actually control all diamond production from these areas and buy the diamonds from any diggers operating there at a price that WAMCO deemed to be fair. So, you know, obviously, it's not much of a deal for anybody. We discovered this, in fact, by accident, and it was rather an embarrassment. It was a huge embarrassment for the government. What had happened was that the Kimberley Process sent a review team in early January 2005. And the Ministry of Lands and Mines had produced a document, a briefing document for the Kimberley Process review team. The Deputy Minister had asked the Minister at the time, Jonathan Mason, what he should and shouldn't put in the document. And Mason apparently said, just put everything in, give it to me on Friday night, I'll read it over the weekend, and then anything that needs to come out, we'll take it out and we'll give it to them on Monday morning. Anyway, needless to say, the document was produced, the Deputy Minister put everything in it. And Mason didn't bother to read it over the weekend, handed it out Monday morning, and there was a paragraph at the end saying, we have engaged in a sort of unbelievably crooked contract with a company called WAMCO, which, as we did some research, and it turned out that WAMCO is being fronted by this a guy who had a link to the Corsican mafia. He was travelling around, he was a French guy, travelling around in a Liberian diplomatic passport as their UNESCO ambassador, or ambassador to UNESCO. I mean, the whole thing was just a joke. So this obviously, reflected very badly on the ministry's ability to actually act sensibly and to implement the reforms necessary for Kimberley compliancy. So as a result, we lost the whole of 2005 because the international community and the donors said, we're just not dealing with these people. We'll wait until Ellen's been elected and then we'll start all over again. We're not going to hand out money to these people, given the way that they behaved about this. So we lost a year, basically. And then beginning of 2006, after the election and the inauguration, things started to move quite quickly. The money hit the ground, and some of that money was used to pay for an American consultant who was a sort of expert in systems management and all the rest of it. So they brought this guy in to try and get the whole thing off its backside, basically, and get it up and running. This has proved to have been quite difficult, really. I mean, there's a lot of various components that need to be put in place to actually create a Kimberley-compliant system of internal controls that accurately tracks diamond production from mines in very remote areas of Liberia to the point of export at the government diamond office in Monrovia. And while one can put together a kind of work plan and all the rest of it, there are all sorts of other unforeseen or at least overlooked factors such as the weather and the rainy season and all the rest of it that combine to slow things down enormously, particularly when it comes to moving infrastructure, prefabricated buildings and all that kind of thing up into the bush. the situation we're at the moment is that pretty much there's been steady achievement actually over the past year. And the situation we have at the moment is that we've got most of the components that are necessary in country. We've built an assaying lab on the back of the ministry. We're currently awaiting the delivery of equipment to go in there, so computer equipment and scales and lights and photographic equipment. The ministry has sent 3 of its staff off to South Africa for training by De Beers and valuation, which will be necessary for assessing export duty on goods. And we are currently in the process of deploying some of the containers into the bush. I think we've got 6 in place at the moment. We've got about another 4 to go. So there's going to be 10 regional offices, which will be the first point of call for people digging diamonds. When they found diamonds, they'll report to the local diamond office, be given a certificate. And this certificate will continue along a sort of chain of custody and control as the diamonds move through various middlemen and brokers towards the exporters, the licensed exporters, before being exported onto the international market. At the moment, though, we still don't have a functioning system, and we estimate that it might take between another 3 and 4 months to actually get this up and running. So it remains to be seen how the Council will react to our report later this week. But that's the current sort of state of affairs at the moment. They're working very hard to try and get the thing up and running. There have been a number of problems, some of them quite serious. I think the government has worked hard to overcome most of those, and we're confident now that and the Kimberley process is confident that they'll have a fully functioning system in the not-too-distant future. Just by way of a bit of background, there have been some other external complications which haven't helped the situation, not least the Leonardo DiCaprio film, which has just been released, which has obviously drawn quite a lot of media attention towards the diamond industry, particularly in West Africa. As a result, the Kimberley process itself now is very, very sensitive about the quality of its processes in various West African countries. At the Kimberley process plenary last month, it became clear that Ghana, in particular, had a very, very faulty system, which was being used by, in fact, Latin American producers, namely Venezuelan, Guyanese, and northern Brazilian, to launder, well, in fact, to pass diamonds through onto the international market, so that they would pick up the much lower rate of duty of 3% rather than incur an 8 or 10% duty in Latin America. And it was very, very large volumes of goods. People estimate up to 1 million carats a year. So this has all come out. This has obviously placed additional pressure on the authorities in Liberia to come up with a very squeaky clean and watertight system. So with a view to that, they are now working at double speed and twice as hard to try and make sure that this thing really does work and will be acceptable to the Kimberley process when they make their formal application to join at some point next year, I imagine. But that's where we are at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Casper. Steve, some response.
Thanks. What I think I'll do is just try to put all this into a somewhat broader context as to a little bit as to what in the broader picture is going on in Liberia at the moment. For those of you that haven't been out there, it's hard to imagine the extent of the destruction that's taken place over the last 15 to 20 years in almost every imaginable way. Per capita income today is 1/6 of what it was in 1979. 1/6. It's actually really hard to do that. That takes wanton destruction to do that. It takes losing 1/3 of the population to either death or fleeing to refugee status. Agricultural production stops. Timber and diamond production stop. Rubber production almost stops, basically stops. People don't have any incomes. They're just living on absolute subsistence. Communities that were once integrated are totally cut off. There are no roads really that work. They just have to regrade each year, open up and link some of the villages, but most of them are not linked. There's been no electricity in the country for 15 years, none, except for private generators until a small portion of Monrovia was returned to power this year. Same with water. No piped water anywhere in the country for 15 years. This summer when they turned the water back on, there were kids watching water come out of the pipe that were stunned. Instead of running into the water and splashing around as soon as the water was turned on, they stood back in utter amazement because they had never seen anything like this before. A couple of minutes later, they were running around in the water, but their first reaction was stunned disbelief that water could come out of a pipe. The place, there are bullet holes in all the buildings. There are many of the buildings. There are many buildings that the tops have been cut off. The roofs aren't there, that are overgrown. And at a human capacity level, lots and lots of people left. And so rebuilding in terms of just human capacity as well as the physical capacity is really going to be extremely difficult. So they fell really to rock bottom. Into this context comes the election last year, two rounds of elections. The UN around the world is much maligned. This is a great success for the UN in terms of helping to pull Liberia out of this, having 2 rounds of successful elections, having 13,000 UN troops in there that have kept the peace by and large for now more than 3 years. And I think the UN deserves a tremendous amount of respect and gratitude for what they've pulled off there. It hasn't been difficult, it hasn't been easy, it hasn't been without its problems, but for all of the criticisms they get, here's a place where they have actually helped put things back on solid footing in the beginning of a turnaround. So President Sirleaf starts her term in mid-January last year. We've talked about a year of progress. It's actually a lot less. By the time our cabinet was in place, it was really April. So we're talking really 7 or 8 months so far of what has happened. She's put together one of the best cabinets, I think, in sub-Saharan Africa, an outstanding finance minister, a very good governor at the central bank, good planning minister, head of the National Investment Board is quite strong, and several of the other ministers are quite good. Capacity underneath that is very, very thin. The agenda for action is very long, as you can imagine, and trying to figure out what you'd like to do first is difficult enough, but then actually marshaling the troops to get things done, from infrastructure to schools to hospitals to clinics to figuring out the foreign debt mess to putting in anti-corruption issues to doing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and on. It's a very long list, and there aren't that many people that you can call on. So it's very difficult, but they've taken firm steps. The President immediately put into place a 150-day action plan, which was a matrix that was, I believe the final form was 16 pages long of actions that they wanted to take in the first 150 days, rather ambitious to say the least. They got about 3/4 of them done, which was pretty remarkable, with a lot of help from the donors, from the partners. Revenues jumped by about 20-25% almost immediately by putting some basic financial controls on, putting the budget into a cash management system, cutting down on basic corruption at the ports. And revenue this year compared to last year is going to be about a 50% increase, which is great. Now, mind you, the budget for the last 3 years has been $80 million. Total budget, $80 million for a country. It's going to be about $120 million this year, which is a great improvement, 50%, but it's still a very small budget to work with. So they're increasing revenues, putting in the financial controls, and I think that's an important first step in terms of some of the issues we've been talking about here. The President's plan basically is to focus on what she calls four different pillars that fits together. One is enhancing security. The second is revitalizing economic growth. The third is strengthening governance institutions. And the fourth is improving basic services and infrastructure. And she sees these 4 links as the foundation for revitalizing the economy, and they're taking steps on each of these. There's real optimism there. I've had the privilege of being there 7 times in the last year, and it's actually kind of a fun way to go because it's almost like snapshots in a little film, as you can see it go by every couple of months and see the progress. People are painting their storefronts. They're putting a new level up on a new level on their buildings, either houses or their stores. Every time I go, there are more storefronts that are open. The lines in front of the building supply shops, or there's always several trucks out there that are loading up with cement or tools. And there are more people out on the streets now that there's electricity at night. On some of the streets, you see more and more people that feel safe, that are out. Drivers are complaining about traffic. All kinds of good signs that things are coming back. But there are huge risks here, huge risks. Even with a great team, with strong support from the donor community and led by just an incredibly outstanding individual, the risks here are very, very high, and we shouldn't kid ourselves about it at all. I think it's very much in the interest of the United States to make this work, and I think it's very much in the interest of the rest of the world to make it work. Not just for Liberia's sake. I don't want to claim more than it's a relatively small country, but worldwide we are thinking about how failed states endanger our own national security and that of the world. And we've seen countless places around the world where failed states hurt us, hurt the rest of the world, hurt the people that live there, hurt the region. And we're trying to figure out how to make it work, how to rebuild countries in Afghanistan, obviously Iraq, Sudan, lots of other places. Here's a place we can make it work. We got to make it work here, because if we can't make it work in a place that's relatively small, that doesn't have the religious conflicts that other countries have, that has one of the best governments that you could ever hope to have, if we can't make it work here, we got problems in our broader strategy about engaging with failed and fragile states. So I think this is really important for the world to engage in a very strong and muscular way. The U.S. has done pretty well in that regard. Not as well as I think I had hoped and as they could be. There's a lot of other issues on the agenda, but I think, I hope in this next year we'll really see the step up to make the extra effort at the diplomatic level, at the financial level, at the increasing ready engagement level to make this work. There are lots of different economic activities that need to get back on their feet. The timber and the diamonds are big ones. They can employ a lot of people. That helps on the security side, get people off the streets, get the young men back to work. They can help on the financial side by bringing in revenues. They can help build infrastructure. But these are complicated sectors. They need to be complemented with building the infrastructure out to these areas to bring things back in, getting agriculture going, getting urban services going, and many other links to make this whole thing work. So it's a tough situation. I take hope by recognizing that in Africa we have seen failed states recover. There are three, at least, excellent examples of this. Mozambique in 1991 was every bit in trouble as Liberia is today. And there's been 15 years of 7 to 8% growth in Mozambique. There's been 4 elections. They're back on the road. They're doing just fine. And I think that provides an excellent model. And in fact, Liberia's growth rate this year will be around 8 to 9%, so the IMF says, and I think that's about right. Uganda was every bit the mess in the early 80s. Hasn't had quite the movement on the political side, but on the economic side, it was a disaster in the early 80s, and it has come a very, very long way. And in the last 10 years, Rwanda, which obviously was a huge mess a decade ago, has done pretty well in terms of economic recovery. Again, some issues on the political side. But there are models where this can happen, where you can have success. And I think with a little bit of luck, with great efforts by the Liberians themselves, with support from the international community, that there's potential for Liberia to see 7 to 8% growth rates over the next decade or more and to get back on their feet. But as I say, big risks and some potential for it to go the other way as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Boy, this panel has been very disciplined. we have gone through with an average of 10 minutes per. So it's going to leave us a lot of time for questions. Now, the routine here is that if you're going to ask a question, please identify yourself by standing up. We do have microphones, which will be distributed because we're trying to record this. So please speak into the microphone. And as we've identified ourselves to you, you identify yourself to us. We want to know who you are when you're going to speak. But let me begin, as the chair often does, with the first question. And it's going to be directed at Steve. I will invite the panelists to pitch in on in any and all questions. But Steve, you didn't comment directly on whether you think sanctions on diamonds and timber should be lifted now or not. What is your opinion on that, from your perspective?
Well, there's a good reason, is because I'm not the expert on the sanctions. So I should. My personal opinion is that I think there has been a lot of movement on the timber side. The sanctions have been partially lifted already, and I think that's where the potential is for the most rapid progress to get the sanctions fully lifted soon, and to get private sector activity going in there quickly. So I think I would favor moving quickly on the timber sanctions, and it seems to be happening. On the diamonds, I think it's every right to be cautious. the potential, the downside potential on the diamond side is pretty big. So I would not advocate for immediate removal of those. I don't think the President would quite either, although she certainly is advocating for pushing as quickly as we can to get the systems in place. But I think everybody recognizes that particularly with diamonds, we've got to be really careful and make sure everything's in place.
Okay, that was going to be my follow-up, how the President saw that and whether she
Well, I don't want to speak for the President. I think...
Understand.
Again, I'll say I think that she would like to move as quickly as possible, but I don't want to claim that she wants what her position is on this right at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we throw it open to the floor. Right, we've got some takers right there. Howard?
Thanks, Steve. Howard Jeter, Good Works International. If, in fact, there were 70 timber companies operating in Liberia, what impact has this had on the base resource?
Thank you for your question. Just to clarify, too, the timber sanctions have been fully lifted now. Is it fully? Yeah, so as of October, they're completely off. So the council is, I guess, presumably is happy that the conditions have been met. Do you mean in terms of the forest base itself? It varies, obviously, depending on where you are in the country. If you look at the most valuable species, the mahoganies and things like that, in a lot of places they're basically gone. Yeah. So now what you're sort of logged down to the next tier. In terms of deforestation, there hasn't been widespread deforestation because of the logging. And that's because tropical logging isn't like clear-cut logging in North America. You know, within an area the size of a soccer field, there'll maybe be 1 or 2 trees that are commercially valuable enough to warrant going all the way in and getting them and pulling them out. So you don't see clear-cutting in the tropics the way you do in the temperate zones. There's a lot of destruction to the canopy to get those couple trees. Not to say that, but you don't see widespread felling. Is that what you were sort of asking about, or is there more detail that you'd like?
I'm wondering if there's still, with that many companies operating over a period of years, if in fact you said that the sanctions have been lifted on timber operations, is there a resource that remains that
Sure,
can be
okay. Yeah, in fact,
sustained over time?
If you look at the West Guinean forest, so extending from sort of Guinea all the way down to Ghana, which is a big area, right? And one of the most highly valuable areas in the world in terms of biodiversity. It's got, species that are found nowhere else. It's one of the few hotspots, if you're familiar with that sort of biodiversity jargon. In that big area, half of the forest that remains is in Liberia. So in fact, Liberia is a very forested country compared to its neighbors. So there is actually a large resource left. Some of the really high valuable stuff is gone, but there's still lots of other species that are there. So there is something, one, worth preserving because so much of it has gone elsewhere, but also there is the base for an industry if you wanted to do one. But we shouldn't overestimate what that sort of the industry is going to be worth because of this problem that, not every tree is valuable. The latest estimates are that if you do it sustainably, the revenue generated would be about $100 million a year, of which the government, if they were efficient, would get their 20%. But past governments were not efficient. They're efficient about getting money in other ways, but not through taxation. So when the companies left, in the review, it was found that there was $64 million in arrears. So the country had not benefited from those 70 companies operating, but there is a resource to go forward from.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Same side.
Hi, Joe Bell from Hogan and Hartson. Well, Steve, for instance, ended by mentioning that there were some very serious problems and challenges ahead for the government. And I was wondering whether members of the panel might point to what they see looking in the next 12 months, the 3 or 4 most critical issues and what really needs to be done either by the international community or by the Liberians to address those issues. Excuse my cold.
Mm-hmm.
Should we take turns?
Yeah, just
I'll just start by giving this sort of introduction from our report, which is going to be out. It's publicly available. All our reports to the Security Council are publicly available and on the Security Council website, the Sanctions Committee. Our report, the most recent one, will be available December 15th, if you'd like to. And we can make sure that give you the URL so if people want to get it, they can get it. There are a number of, in terms of investment, investment capital is going to be a big problem. I talk to bankers in Liberia, and I say, what is the rate that you make commercial loans at? And this is to quote one of the bankers, I do everything I can to make sure my employees do not make any loans. Zero. I strongly discourage them from making loans. They make all their money on transaction fees. All right? So capital is a huge problem. Access to capital is a major problem. And to that end, you want to stimulate investment. And not to disparage the good work done by the president, because the turnaround in the last year has been truly remarkable. But this government has been trying to review all the contracts and concessions that were made during the transitional period. And so far, although I understand today the Mittal contract has been signed, but until that, not one has been done. And that must have a negative impact on investment. If you think that you're going to go to Liberia and you're going to have your contract held up for a year while they fight over whether or not it's valid or not. But the president recognizes this, and she says that has to be finished by December 31st. This has to stop. We got to move forward. But you can't move forward at the expense of corrupt contracts. So there was play within the government itself. There is this capacity problem where you do have a very good cabinet, but there is these patronage networks still exist that we talked about, including in government. 2, corruption exists in government. There are a lot of the same people that have been there for the past 20, 30 years. And the third is that although they're very competent at the top, there's still a lot of competency problems sort of within the civil service. And one example that we like to talk about is the diamonds, where, as Casper mentioned, especially after the WAMCO scandal, there was very little government, international money to help the government become Kimberley compliant. But the government themselves didn't even spend the money they had. They left the end of the last fiscal year having spent only just over 50% of their budget. So they're complaining that they don't have enough money to become Kimberley compliant, and they're not even spending their own money. But they can't because they don't know how. And this is a real problem, but this is where, fortunately, that's one of the easier ones that we can fix. We can help them build capacity. That's not to say that they're actually going to do it, but at least if you can find people that are interested in working, we can help train them. But until they're trained, until they can spend money, nothing's going to get better. So these are the real problems that exist that are preventing the country from moving forward. But this isn't unique to Liberia either. I think you're right that this is a challenge for recovering countries that we've got to address elsewhere, not just in Liberia. So I probably said enough.
Part of the question was what specific actions are being taken to address this problem?
Taken by the international community or by the government?
Community or inside of Liberia?
Well, I think I've sort of, the ending by December 31st to get those concessions and contract review finished. The training that's being done by the international community. So things are being done. I'll just stop talking.
Yeah, I was going to say something not economic, but just on a judicial system. Yeah. I think that the judicial system reform is woefully behind schedule. I think that the ideas that UNMIL had in hand misguided. They haven't. I think, again, what I was saying about the focus always on Monrovia, the international community and the government needs to move out of Monrovia, needs to get into the provinces. At the moment, the police, the security services are policing. They don't understand what the rule of law means or how to enforce it, and the people don't understand that either. If you're to combat patronage systems, if you're to stop this balkanization, if you're to have accountability, if you're to have transparent concessions, you need to implement rule of law across the board, and it isn't happening. And I think that's a long-term problem, but you can't just sort of say, well, it's a long-term problem. What's the most pressing issue? Like, that is the most pressing issue. A good example about just general security. the council gave a waiver on the weapons, the weapons ban, and they allowed the SSS, the Special Security Service, to have weapons. And as we speak now, the weapons have arrived for the new AFL, which the American government is helping to restructure, and the weapons have arrived for the police. Now, the SSS are the most well-trained, or meant to be the most well-trained of the units, armed units in Liberia. And, within, a couple of months of them getting the guns, there were already 2 incidents where, the bodyguard of the director of the SSS was shot dead by another one of the SSS guys over some argument. And there was another shooting incident. And if this is happening with the SSS, and then you're going to arm like 700 policemen, it's just absolutely crazy. So, those issues are kind of pretty important. And if justice doesn't move out, if the focus isn't switched both by UNMIL and by the government into the provinces, you're going to have large areas where you will have, armed people roaming around, even policemen, who will have probably stronger tribal affinities than they do to the idea of the state or the rule of law. And that is problematic.
Any additions?
Go ahead.
I think Tim's right in terms of the focus on the judicial system. It's going to take a long time to do that. In terms of immediate impact, the top of the list, I think, is employment, in getting the young men off the street. And Joe, you know this well. You see them on the street, and they need to get to work. And that's, I think, central for security reasons. These are the guys you need them to work all day, and so they go home at night and go to sleep instead of causing trouble. But also to get income into people's hands, but also to use their work as a means of building simple infrastructure. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I think that is really the central challenge. Part of that, of course, is getting agriculture going, because that's where you're really going to employ the most people over the next year or two, and that again dovetails with Tim's point. The key is to do this in the rural areas. And that brings you back to roads, which I think are, again, central for security, central for governance, central for law and order, central for economic revival. So I think in terms of, if you want employment, you need agriculture, you need the roads, at least from an economic perspective. And then just one final comment on Art's point about Mittal. It hasn't really been a year, it's really been 6 months. Because, again, the cabinet wasn't in place until April, and I think they really started discussions with Mittal in 6 months. I actually think coming to closure on a very complex deal with Mittal in a war-torn country in 6 months is pretty good. And I think actually the response from most private sector people is going to be, wow, they cut a deal with Mittal. This place is serious. And the first few are always going to be slower. But smaller deals, less complex deals, especially when the first one is in place, I think are going to begin to happen sooner. I actually thought this one would take longer than it has. So I think most people will be pleased with the speed.
Casper?
I would just add that, I mean, obviously on the diamond side, Kimberley compliance is the most pressing issue at the moment. I mean, it needs to be done within the next 6 months, and I think the international community now is very keen that should happen. There needs to be a review of existing concessions, both on the exploitation side and on the exploration side, I think. We were hoping that would be underway by now, but there have been problems with the GMAP personnel who were undertaking that task. So I would just, stress that I think within the Ministry of Lands and Mines, anyway, the key issues at the moment are KP compliancy and general kind of assessment of pre-existing contracts and concessions.
In my recent experience out there, related to, I think, pieces of each of your responses, has been the problems of youth, former combatants, but also non-former combatants, street youth, gangs. Obviously impacts the unemployment problem. Any particular perspective on how to handle the youth problem that really is growing out there? When we did our training in April with this workshop on national reconciliation and collaboration, we had a number of youth representatives there and former combatants, and they really are looking. They feel that Truth and Reconciliation Commission may come up with sort of a conclusion that blames the youth in a great way for a lot of the violence of the past, and it may be a real trigger for further violence. I mean, they're seeing this as a possible trigger for further violence and a return to some of the awful things of the past. What are your perspectives on that?
Well, I'll come at a different angle. Having spent a couple of months in Nigeria this year in the Delta, what you see there is young men are used very cynically by politicians as sort of muscle gangs, bodyguards, etc., and most importantly for voting purposes. And I think that's having a large unemployed body of young men who have used to been fighting, and that's a dangerous thing in Liberia. And sometimes you wonder whether certain sectors of political sectors want to keep it like that. A good example, again, is when we're talking about the patronage systems in, say, you take the rubber plantations, acted as magnets for a lot of young men. They need money. And in some ways, these guys are going to find ways to earn money. They want to put food on their table for their girlfriends or their children or whatever, and that's, you totally expect that. But say that as the plantations acted as a magnet for them, at the same time when, say, Paul Sangate, this ex-Model general who was arrested and brought to Monrovia, he disappeared. I mean, talking about judicial reform. He was given bail and he disappeared. And, one can suspect that there are very highly placed individuals, political individuals in a house who had a vested interest in keeping the status quo in the rubber plantation because they received money from it. This sort of the control of the youth and moving into political circles is linked. We mentioned today about Mittal. It's very interesting. It will be very interesting to have a look at the details of the Mittal steel deal because beforehand, when the first draft was on the table, it was very open about who would receive the security contracts for guarding the Mittal Steel facilities. And of course, you have Adolphus Dollo, who was the young General Peanut Butter, who is an MPFL guy who, Mittal Steel base is up in Nimba County, which he is the senior senator of. And he ran a security firm called, North Star, that's it. And so it looked like North Star was going to get this contract for security for Mittal Steel. And it'll be interesting to see if there's any provisions put into the new contract, because, essentially that contract was, it knocks on to Gus Kerwoven's OTC. So, as I said, how to solve the problem of young men, I think that's not just a Liberian problem, that is a regional Gulf of Guinea Africa subcontinent problem as well, but especially in the Gulf of Guinea. But as I said, sometimes
on the youth, there's a little bit of gap, I think, on the donor side. Donors love to train and do training programs, but training programs don't do you any good if the training program ends and there isn't a job. And that was actually a problem in Sierra Leone, where there are lots of training programs and not that many jobs. And so we've got to create some jobs, and some of that has got to be, frankly, artificial jobs as a gap filler for the next year or two as the economy gets back on its feet. And by that I mean some urban, some rural-based programs, some of it make work, clean up, a fund and NGOs and public-private partnerships to set up to hire people for day work, for cleaning up the city, for repainting, for cleaning out the trenches, and then do it again 2 weeks later. And in the urban area, in the rural areas as well, on road networks. Now, some of this is beginning to happen. As was mentioned, the World Bank and the UN have this new road project. Eric Nelson is here from the World Bank and knows more about it, I think, probably than anybody else here. But a partnership where the UN is, UNMIL, the troops are actually supplying engineers from among their troops and some of the heavy equipment. And the bank is providing funding for road materials and the ability to hire local labor. So it's actually kind of an innovative partnership, if I've got that broadly correct, Eric. So those kinds of innovative things. But to get the youth problem, I think you've got to think beyond training and figuring out how to, in a very quick way, get a lot of people to work. There's a lot of things that can be done. There's a lot of young men sitting around that would do it for a wage, and we've got to be much more creative and get out of the traditional boxes of how we can get these guys to work in a hurry. And it's not happening as fast as it should.
Okay. All right. Let's go to this side. We haven't had one from over there.
I have a loud voice anyway, so I should really hold this far back. But my name is Sarah Prey. I'm with Publish What You Pay. I'd love to hear perhaps if anybody would weigh in on the perspective of Liberians. That's sort of a perspective that might be missing on this panel, but if anybody wanted to sort of speak on behalf of maybe somebody that you've talked to in Liberia, but on the sanctions, I'd love to hear about the Mittal Steel deal and that, sort of falling apart and the government's reaction to that. And also on access to information, I don't know if anybody could comment on whether or not the average Liberian would have the resources to find out more about, some of these timber contracts or the diamond industry, et cetera.
Thank you very much for that question. First of all, I wanted to say that Ambassador Miner was invited, but he's in Monrovia now. Let's let anyone on the panel who wants to respond, and then we can let a Liberian also speak in a moment.
Sure, I thought I would have some idea of a specific question.
Yeah.
She asked because I work with the councillor here on the communication
Please
aspect
identify
of
yourself and...
Okay, my name is John Collier. I'm a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm a journalist who've worked in Liberia for quite some very long time, if you will, close to 20 years. And I worked with the councillor here with on the timber stuff about all these ragtag soldiers and armies that were run by the various groups. And we were talking drum, Search for Common Ground, did the work in the interior there. The question she asked is a key one, and that's what we're working on, with how the people really get involved. Communication-wise, that's totally lacking in the country. The people don't have any access to a kind of information on what should be done in the timber sector, in the diamond sector, and all this. What we're talking is simply the elite. The country people do not have access to all this. To do this, this is not the work of the UN panel here, but we're working toward how the media can really get involved in getting the people to understand through local radios. But there's a serious problem with communication. You were talking about the Liberian perspective. Indeed, the people were like sanctions lifted on all because they want to see their lives revived. And I was listening to Steve here. What he was saying are all just the truth. The truth is that this country has been through just too much. Just too much. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is about 70 years old. She would have loved to have more time to serve the country. She's a woman. She's in closing on her 70s. She would like democratically, after she's spoken for years, to see herself get out in 6 years. So she's in a haste to try and do something, to leave a legacy behind. But she depends to a large extent on what, and I must stress this, what Americans will do to try and help Liberia. And I like the point. Because of our long-time relationship with America, that country was established in 1847. Got its independence in 1847, actually, established in 1822 for resettlement of free slaves. That linkage has been there. And much of the mockery around Africa has been, you should be so-called 51st state or 53rd state of America. What is there to prove that you have this alliance with the U.S.? And I like what Steve said. We have to do something about this. Or else the part of the youth that these people are referring to. You have a country where after long years of war, you instituted a measure to disarm people, a demobilization process. This process took into account first around 40,000 combatants that should have been disarmed. When the proper thing got underway, we ended up disarming, in words, actually 110,000 combatants. Simply because the UN went in there and said, listen, instead of bringing guns, you can bring 30 pieces of ammunition and you will get the benefits that you should have. So all somebody had to do, if they had, if you will, 100 ammunitions or gunshots, would be to share among brothers and sisters because there was money available for this. So you ended up with a huge expectation on the UN resources. 110,000 people disarmed. You have to cater for those 110,000 people, but in real numbers, no, that's not it. So there's a huge demand on this. And so there's no reintegration actually in place. You get a guy, okay, 4 weeks, you okay, go into the field. What does he go to do? Can you learn to run a good service, if you were to become a mason, for example, in 6 weeks, difficult. So you put up this incompetent guy on the market, and he's got nothing to work with, nothing to do, because he's not trained sufficiently to work. So the point that they're making about reintegration failure is indeed true. And there are a lot of other things that we will keep talking as we go on here, we hope we have time for. But just to give you an insight of what Liberians think, I'd just like to say that.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Ghali. Certainly, yes.
Sorry. Thank you. Hello, my name is James Rocco, and I have been alluded to anonymously as the person who helped the forest concession review, and I was actually just in Liberia to help out on the broader concession review. And the only thing I want to do, I promise you I'm not going to give a speech, and the gentleman, my colleague from Liberia, I think was very articulate on the reality of the situation and how difficult it will be to really accomplish reintegration, demobilization, and so forth. I'm just going to give a little footnote in, I hope, partial response to the question on the development of kind of civic democracy through transparency and engagement of civil society. The Forest Concession Review, which Art Blundell mentioned, always had from the beginning a strong component, at least on paper, of citizen participation. And as a matter of fact, the Forest Concession Review in its final stage was brought about because civil society rebelled against previous in-house forest concession reviews that were totally unsatisfactory. So, among other things, there were a number of meetings throughout the country with the community representatives and members of the community and civil society organizations that were both general meetings, and then there were separate focus group meetings, both on their comments on the conduct of the specific timber companies that were under review, and second, their ideas for reform. In there lies a tale, which I won't tell now. There is an article which I co-authored that I think might be alluded to on the Woodrow Wilson's website that was published, I hope, I still haven't seen the final version, in the Journal of Peacekeeping and Development, which goes into that a little bit more. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the future with reference to the concession reviews. The transparency and public participation aspects of the concession review, I think, will be, we hope, embodied and institutionalized in the future through at least two processes. One is institutionalized public participation and transparency in decisions by the Forest Development Authority on both specific concessions and also the ongoing process of reforming their rules and regulations, which is still going on. Excuse me. And secondly, the hope is to generally strengthen civil society organizations using forest concession as a model, including community forestry and other aspects. So you really strengthen this idea of institutional public participation, which is a key aspect of the rule of law, which was mentioned. So I just wanted to fill that in a little bit more. I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Okay, thank you, James. Appreciate that very much. Any responses from the panel on that particular question?
Could I just say just about the public participation, because I think it's really key to try to democratize the governance of the forest resources in the hopes that it actually spreads into the governance of the country itself. And to that end, we've tried to make public participation, as Jim was alluding to. For example, in the passage of the new forest law, which just occurred in September, the hearings were broadcast on the radio. The U.S. government helped pay to make sure that that happened so that people could hear what was being discussed about their future. And the UN has set up a radio station network throughout the country to try to get the word out. So the UN is also trying to educate people within the country. But it's one thing, first of all, to reach people, which is non-trivial in a place like Liberia whose roads are so bad. But then the other thing is that they have to trust that it's worth engaging and participating. And so that trust is being developed too. That's not just going to happen right away. They're going to have to decide that it really is worth their time to engage. And I think so. I'm optimistic that even though you don't see strong participation yet, I'm optimistic that at least it's worth the effort to continue.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go for another question.
My name's Susie Crate. I'm a professor at George Mason, and I have questions mostly about diamonds. I'm wondering if there's been a projected lifespan of the diamond economy in Liberia. I'll just rattle off my questions, and then you can. Then I'm wondering, are they alluvial diamonds? Are they kimberlite pipes, open pit or closed? And are they mostly gem diamonds or industrial? And then a question, I guess, for Steve would be, and for Casper also, has a cutting industry been considered as a way of employing people as far as cutting the diamonds before they're exported? And then the last question about diamonds is, will the Kimberley process guarantee transparency for the diamond industry?
I think just on the sort of geological side of things, it's very difficult to project the longevity of the deposits in Liberia. Liberia's got a problem. The problem with Liberia is that the water table is so high. Now, most of the diamonds in fact, all the diamonds being mined at the moment are alluvial diamonds. So this means that they're essentially in riverbeds or they're in paleo riverbeds. And getting at them is often very, very difficult indeed. It requires a lot of pumping, so there's a lot of capital investment in order to clear an area, in order to get down to the gravel, to extract the gravel, then get it out for washing. Much more so than in Sierra Leone next door. Now, much of the country, as you know, hasn't been mapped either. A far larger proportion of Sierra Leone has been mapped. So it is difficult to tell what the kind of complete geology of the country is at the moment anyway. It would appear that most of the goods that are being mined are as I say, they're a mixture of industrial, near gem and gem, but for the most part, they're sort of lower order of gem. They're not bad quality, but they're not fantastic either. It's not like Angolan or Botswanan goods. As far as the KP is concerned, no, there's no guarantee that it's going to be completely transparent. I mean, it won't be. All it's going to be is better than it was. And it will give, I think, at least the government will have a clear idea of who's actually digging diamonds and who's exporting diamonds and what the broad value of that production is, and it will be able to take a tax on that. The diamonds are not going to provide revenue for building schools, hospitals, railways, and everything else. It's simply not going to happen, particularly on the way that the deposits are arranged in the country at the moment. I mean, if you've only got, let's say, you're doing, $10 to $15 million a year, the government's going to be taking 3% of the export on that. It's not very much money. It won't be like Sierra Leone, and it certainly won't be like Botswana, where you've got a $2-3 billion industry and you've got 1.5 million people living in the country. It is not. There was a certain expectation when we started this job, particularly, and we had to make this quite clear, and we did it over the radio, in fact, to say that diamonds are not going to be the kind of cure-all for the country. They're really not. What they require is some degree of control, and they may just about pay over time for that control mechanism to be maintained. But other than that, there's not going to be much development on the back of the Liberian diamond industry.
Yeah, the Mittal steel deal will dwarf both of these combined.
That's a different kettle of fish altogether, exactly.
Yeah, so this is a small number of people. It could create some jobs. In terms of cutting, I think we're not there yet, and it's not for the government to decide, frankly, whether cutting makes sense or not. I think the path forward would be to make sure that all the controls are in place in the right kind of way, get the sanctions lifted, and then engage, begin the process with private sector actors that would decide whether or not cutting makes sense. And that's going to depend on the quality of the gems and lots of other considerations that's not really for the government to decide.
Can I just add that there are a number of international exploration companies who are operating in Liberia at the moment, and between them they found 8 kimberlites so far, but it's not clear whether any of these kimberlites are viable in mining terms. They may be, they may not be, and we're waiting for information on the sampling and the testing of kind of initial drilling. On the manufacturing side, there's a guy here on 47th Street whose name escapes me at the moment, but he is seriously planning a manufacturing centre in Freetown. So whether that will have an impact for Liberian goods, I don't know. Whether it will work long term, I don't know. It's very difficult to pay people to go out to West Africa when they can go to Dubai, or when they can go to Antwerp to do that kind of job. So we'll see.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got someone right at the back there who's been trying for a long time. Rosaline, right at the back.
I'm the President Emeritus of Africa. I'm now serving on something called a HELP Commission, which is a congressional commission looking at foreign assistance over the next 2 years to find out how effective it is. But I have a couple of questions. My first question is, what kind of security do we have in Liberia for the people in general, but more specifically for the president of the country? What is being done to make sure that's working for the president of the country? The second question I have, I couldn't understand this budget figure, this figure you gave out of $140 million.
120.
I mean, that's mind-boggling, to think that of the $140 million, where did the money come from? How much of it was U.S., how much was abroad, or whatever?
That's the government budget, that's government revenues. That's
government revenues?
That's the government
Could
revenue.
you say something about the level of bilateral assistance that's going to Liberia? Not just U.S. bilaterals, but in general, because I don't think there's much opportunity to build a nation state unless we are serious about the level of assistance to this country. When you start talking $50 to $100 million in a place like Liberia, you're really talking peanuts. Because here's a place that's been virtually destroyed, which we invested thousands of hours of diplomatic time and money trying to get rid of Charles Taylor and others, and now we found this woman who is I don't use the word democracy, I talk about good governance. Now, unless we have a master plan to help this country get back on its feet, it's going to be a disaster. And one has to remember to talk about Liberia being the responsibility of the Americans. That's not going to get us anywhere. We live in a global community, and the Chinese are already there, right? They're already there, and the Lebanese have already been there. So the point is that this idea of building Liberia from a failed state to a gem in Africa headed up by this magnificent woman, and by the way, I'm not as moved by your prediction of her reaching 7 and having to turn it down. That was an insult to me since I'm already 74. I feel I got 20 more years to go. But I'm serious here. We're really talking, we're talking nickels and dimes. Certainly it doesn't have a chance unless the global community makes some real statements about how it's going to rebuild this country. And it's not just money. It's having Liberians to go home and other people to go home to help her get on with the business. But unless we do this, unless we can bring some real security, we're back to the old days.
Thank you, Steve.
I've thrown in about 7 questions there.
Two distinct questions. The first one was on security, if someone wants to try with that for the president.
Yeah, I can briefly try that, and then I'm going to suggest on the donor side, we've got a couple of them sitting here. So instead of me, I'm going to throw the ball to Eric to say what he wants to say about the World Bank, and there's someone from Treasury and probably someone from State that's here that may want to speak about what the U.S. government is doing. Just state the facts. All we want is the facts. So I'll throw the ball to the donors. On the security side, there's 13,500 troops, UN troops that are there. It's the second, my understanding, I'm not a security person, is that that's the second largest UN contingent in the world at the moment after DROC, after Congo. So there's a lot of UN troops, and you see them all over the place. The security situation feels good in the sense that a lot of troops are there. You don't feel that you're at risk. Yes, there's some petty crime, that sort of thing going on. The troops are there, but most of them are taking a snooze during the day, which is perfectly fine with me. So they're not, on the ready like there's a threat at the moment. When they've needed to be on alert, they've been on alert. I happened to be there the day that Taylor was shuffled through for his tourist stop on the way from Nigeria to Sierra Leone, and everybody was on high alert. So at that level, there's plenty of troops, and I think at the moment that sort of macro security situation looks pretty good. That's nationwide. That's nationwide. Now, and again, nationwide at a macro level, of course, one of the huge challenges, perhaps the biggest challenge, will be 2 years from now, or whatever the timing is. At some point, obviously, those UN troops need to phase down, and the Liberian security services need to take over, and that's going to be a crucial transition. In terms of the president's personal security, she's got the Liberian forces that have been trained, the SS, with some mixed results. The U.S. Provided for several months a contingent of personal bodyguards that were quite strong and worked very well. Unfortunately, they left in April or May. And my understanding is that there have been some ongoing discussions about continuing that as a personal cadre. Of course, there was concern about the fire in the President's office and in the Executive Mansion back in July. There have been several investigations into that fire, and all pointed to it being accidental. From faulty wiring, and anyone who stepped foot in the mansion any time in the last 10 years would believe the possibility of faulty wiring setting up a fire. But there are big concerns about personal security. So I think you put your finger on a good issue. For the donor issues, I think I will turn to Eric and
Steve. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
We can start with the World Bank here.
I'm Eric Nelson. I'm the country economist at the World Bank. Basically, there are only three major donors right now. There's the U.S., there's the EC, and there's the World Bank. The World Bank is constrained because of the arrears situation, that the previous governments of this country have run up immense arrears. Steve has done a very good paper on that for the government. We're spending a lot of effort trying to get the arrears to the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and the IMF cleared without it costing anything to the people of Liberia. As it is, even when this happens, and in anticipation of the clearance of arrears, our board allows the bank to spend $35 million a year. This is the limit of how much we can do. The EC is using up money that comes from the current fund, and they're designing a new fund. We all have difficulties, however. It's our wish in most countries that this money be programmed through the budget. And the history of bad governance in Liberia means that most of this money has to be set aside, it has to be ring-fenced, it has to be done outside the budget. We're trying to change that so it goes through. So between the World Bank's $35 million, the U.S. is running, I'm not going to speak for the U.S., it's a larger sum, and the EC is about the same order of magnitude. In September, the Minister of Finance met with the donor community and got some new donors interested. There will be a partner forum which takes place on February 13th and 14th of this coming year.
Here in Washington. Here in Washington.
Here, that's right. And there's going to be a private sector forum on the following day, by the way, for the people here who might be interested in that. And we hope that before that time we're going to get donor interest for a much larger role of the donors in the country.
Okay, thank you.
Eric, do you know how much the Chinese are programming?
No, I do not.
Let's let the State Department representative say something.
Hi, I'm Pete Davis. I'm the desk officer at State for Liberia. I would only say on security, Steve got it right. We're feeling very positive about a lot of the actions that have been taken. The U.S. government-led program to restructure the Liberian Armed Forces is going quite well, and we've done quite a lot in terms of the president's personal security, and we do intend to continue that relationship and make sure that President Sirleaf gets the protection that she needs. In terms of the development assistance, I think our program in FY06 was something approaching $200 million. I mean, you take everything all inclusive, can be broken down all sorts of different ways into different accounts and programs. And I have a lot of USAID colleagues here, so I want to defer to my USAID colleagues on the specific programs. But needless to say, within the State Department, Liberia is among our top priorities, and we take it very, very seriously. I'll hand the microphone to my USAID desk officer colleague very quickly.
Hi, I'm Sarah Swift. I'm the Liberia desk at USAID. Of the 200 million Pete's referring to, I would say probably about 110 would be sort of pure development purposes. We're doing an awful lot of the type of public works, the sort of make work, infrastructure development, small agriculture. Probably about $40 million is going into that this year. Also involved in health, a substantial amount of education, including education geared toward older students who missed out given the many, many years of war. A lot of governance activities, including support for the GMAP, which has come up in other contexts. Just kind of in response to what you were talking about in terms of being peanuts, I definitely have sympathy with that in the sense that, with the needs as enormous as they are, it takes so much more. It's taking so much more in any context, and we do hope to bring in other countries, other new donors, new private sector investors, people to help share the burden. I mean, in terms of what the U.S. government is doing, this is still a pretty remarkable commitment for us. I think if you look at the analysis of this year's funding per capita, Liberia is about 40 times higher than any other place in Africa. So not to say that it's enough or that we shouldn't be doing more everywhere, but I think that this is a real priority for us.
And the peacekeeping operation is costing the international community more than $500 million. So a lot of money is being spent, but a lot of it is being spent on the peacekeeping.
Mm. Okay.
I just wanted to, if I can follow up on that and sort of follow up on Julius's point. There's a total of maybe $500 or $600 million a year that's being committed, and the amount dispersed is even less. It's not enough. It's not enough. These are not the kind of commitments from the international community that are going to make Liberia a success. I think we're taking a big risk here, and we understand that there are bureaucratic constraints within the bank because in the IDIS setting, they basically have a rule of $10 per person. There's 3.5 million Liberians, so it's $35 million. It's nice, but it's not enough, and it doesn't build you a whole lot of roads. $200 million from the U.S., on a per capita basis, that's about $40 or $50 per person. So I sure hope it's not 40 times higher than what anywhere else in Africa is getting, because that means the next highest is $1 per person, which isn't exactly brilliant. We're going to need to step it up, I think. This is a high-risk environment. I think the U.S. needs to see this a little bit as a venture capital. Maybe it's risky. We realize there are a lot of needs around the world, but an extra $50 million, $100 million to Liberia could make a huge difference. And frankly, yeah, I know we have budget deficits, but that's a rounding error in terms of OMB. It's a rounding error that we're talking about to add another $100 million to this that could give it the lift to bring it over the top. Because if the U.S. leads, then the EC has to follow and the Chinese are going to follow. We don't know how much the Chinese are contributing, but they're beginning to contribute a lot. The Chinese are building some roads and doing some other kinds of things. They were one of the first to step up on the road side. The British are involved to a small degree, but they see their major responsibility as Sierra Leone next door. The Swiss have provided a little bit of money. So there's some from different places. But it's not adding up to the kind of huge effort that could be done, because in any kind of global context, these are very small amounts of money that could really get this place back up on its feet and be an example of how we can get a failed state to work.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's turn to another question right down here in the front. Oh, nope.
Thanks. Deborah Harding, Liberian Education Trust. In, I think it was April or May, following Ellen's official visit to the United States, the Congress committed $50 million in a supplemental. Whatever happened to that money?
I have information on that question. I spoke last week to the head of the House staff person who's in charge of the Appropriation Committee. They said that conference was approved, and the money has been approved. And I've got a statement to that effect, but I'm still looking around. Where is it? Is it lost somewhere? It's been approved in the House. I assumed it was signed by the president. Is it lost? That's the question.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Steve, do you have any?
People like myself and Harding running around with misinformation.
Everybody look under their chair and see if we can find the lost money. No, as far as I know, it hasn't been fully programmed yet. The folks.
It's been signed off in conference.
Right, but it hasn't been programmed.
Please, let's talk through the microphone so everyone can hear this discussion.
Okay.
C-Payne, thank you.
No, I mean, the funding has been, the funding, as you say, was signed off by Congress, went through a process with OMB, was ultimately provided to our post in Monrovia in order to program. I would have to look to see exactly how much of it has been programmed, between that and the other sort of, 70-80 million that were programmed. I'd have to see how that breaks out. We did, a substantial amount before the end of the fiscal year, and then we had just for bureaucratic reasons needed to. We will be programming. We're working on programming a substantial amount more now and through the rest of. And in the coming months. And I can provide, if you want to contact me, I'll give you my card. I can provide information on what we're doing with the funds.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a good offer. Let's take a question from the back there.
I'm Bill Stubner from ACDI VOCA. Well, I was wondering about, aid is always nice, but investment's what counts. Are companies like Firestone standing up at all? Are they being incentivized to come back in and start getting people working again?
Firestone's complicated. Firestone's very complicated. There's a long, complicated history, but that's kind of the next big contract after Mittal is to redo Firestone. There's a lot of reasons why it's complicated, not the least that there are some warlords, some ex-combatants and their families that settled on the rubber plantations, and they've been there for 10 years, and moving them is not so easy. But that will be, I think, the next big concession contract focus on. But more broadly, private sector, there's a lot of interest. There was a meeting not too long ago that OPIC organized here where about 60 people attended, private sector oriented. There's the third day of the conference in February will be private sector oriented. And there's a range of activities from an American-based leasing company that's in there that's doing cars and trucks to people interested in agriculture to the beginnings of restaurants. And hotels. There's some interest in some of the banks. So there are some private sector folks that are stepping up, and some investments already happening at a smaller level than Mittal, and others where more interest is being expressed. So.
Say one thing. Yeah. I just want to reiterate about the difficulty for Liberians to access capital, and how this really hinders investment. And, the Lebanese community, which runs a lot of the commerce in West Africa, they can rely on their own network for capital. But a lot of Liberians can't access capital. And maybe something like microfinance, just won the Nobel Peace Prize. Maybe something like that should be considered for Liberia.
We're beginning to run out of time. We only have about 10 minutes. I'm going to recognize 3 more questions. Right here, the gentleman with his hand up, the lady in the white sweater, and the lady right here will be our last 3 questions.
Thank you. I'm Scott Bodie, and I work for USAID, and I've been involved in Liberia since early 2004 on forest sector reform and some agriculture technical assistance. So I'm very familiar with Art's work and Casper's work. I guess this is sort of a comment, and I'm hoping to elicit more discussion, but it's getting kind of late. I also have lived and worked in Sierra Leone and have watched Sierra Leone sort of come back, and all the speakers have kind of hit on this issue, but unless there's a sort of an allegiance to the Liberia or Sierra Leone as a nation, and that the nation, a central government, can deliver services, then we're going to fall into what Tim kind of confirmed some of my underlying fears that I have in these nation-building exercises. Unless our technical assistance actually fundamentally get at that issue of rule of law, why would anybody not stick with the system of patronage. So that's just my sort of comment and fear as we move forward. You know, I'm starting to see articles on Sierra Leone about now that the UN's left, there's this sort of general sense of fear. And so that's just my comment, and I'm happy to hear from the panel or anybody else.
Let's go ahead, because of the shortage of time, take all three of the other two questions. Hope not too much comment, and then we'll have the panel close it up.
My name is Warren Waichi Shaw. I'm Senior Advisor at the U.S. Treasury. I have two questions. One, private sector engagement. Steve has indicated that there are, in fact, individuals and companies that are looking to invest. It seemed to me when I was there in July, there were a lot of areas that the government really was still looking and thinking sort of in the old mindset of donor assistance that really could start out in sort of a new paradigm, putting it directly into private sector and acting as a regulator instead of starting off and then we get into this whole privatization mode, like in urban transportation. Some of those things. What is the government doing to identify areas of activity where they really don't need to be engaged as the implementer to supplement perhaps that private sector? Third day. That's one. Two, the lessons that one should take away in the possibility of Liberia as a success or as a model is in large part based upon GMAP. And I'd just be interested in the comments of the panelists, because it seems to me GMAP was a relatively unique situation, even for a failed state, in that the government in place when GMAP was negotiated had no legitimacy, where almost every other failed state, you know, sort of name it, has a government that has been elected. And so to impose the types of conditions on those countries, I think, would be very difficult. Certainly to impose it even on this present administration would be virtually impossible, given the failed nature of this country. So I'd be curious to get your perspectives on that.
Okay, let's take our last question.
Hi, Tori Holt from the Henry L. Stimson Center. Playing off what Art just suggested, there's a very large UN peacekeeping force. To what extent do they work in cooperation with the panel? Do they help uphold the sanctions in the first place? Do they provide logistics or investigative work? And second, there's no DPKO equivalent to backup panels, and I should stop and say thank you for the excellent work you all do. It's really invaluable. What more could you use from the Secretariat in New York and from member states who sit on the sanctions committees to backstop you? My understanding is that this is an area where many of you come with individual knowledge, use your own resources, and maybe even keep some of your files in your garage. So I'm just curious what we could do to help make that job easier.
Okay, maybe we start with the first one. I think, Tim, you might...
Well, I was going to also pick up something later about the UN. One of the things that I see, and it also comes out just generally in the conversation, is the very difference between a Western-centric approach to West Africa and Liberia and an African approach. And a question answers to how can we create a more viable state in Liberia, how can the UN help more? It's also like how can America or how can the West engage with African states? Like take the UN, take UNMIL for instance. UNMIL is a patchwork of different nations, but really the people who are running it are the Nigerians. They control Monrovia, the Nigerian runs it, and also if you take approaches, like you're talking about economic approaches into Liberia, we do here Mittal Steel or Firestone, and okay, I know the potential for African revenue investment is very small, but face it, Nigeria is the regional master in West Africa. Nigeria did solve the Taylor problem, and again, solving the Taylor problem again raises the issue of the discrepancy between the West and Africa. I mean, David Crane unsealed the indictment for Taylor during a regional conference to solve the Liberian civil war, and that created massive divisions between the special court in Sierra Leone and countries like Ghana where it's being hosted. And so I just want to raise that issue of I think that we can bring our own desires of what we think will work, but I think one of the questions is how can we work with countries like Nigeria? to how can we take on a more regional approach to the problem of Liberia. And this impacts on our work as a panel, because there are other panels, say, for Ivory Coast, and yet, as we all know, that mercenary recruitment is going on, Liberia for Ivory Coast. And that if we look at these things just as, we look at sanctions or UN resolutions on individual countries, then we're going to be falling, we're going to let things fall between the cracks. And so I just wanted to put that out there, and maybe that answers a few of the questions and raises other ones.
Why don't we just come down the line? Okay.
Do you want me to talk about the UN stuff first, or do you want? Okay. Yeah. All right. Just to briefly address your questions, the UNMIL has been very cooperative with us, and without their cooperation, we couldn't do the work we do. They provide us with logistics, including all the helicopter and airplane time we need. It's an incredible luxury that we have. So without them, we couldn't do our work. They don't, however, enforce the sanctions because they don't believe that's their mandate. And part of this is how you interpret a mandate, but they don't believe they have a role in policing. The sanctions, I think, have been relatively effective because for timber anyway, there are so few ports in Liberia, and the hauling costs are so great to haul wood out of Liberia through neighboring countries that we've been able to really make the logging companies believe anyway that we could enforce the sanctions. So they never really reinvested in Liberia after the war and developed an industrial logging sector. So the sanctions were more or less effective, despite the fact that the UN wasn't really, enforcing them. How can we be helped to make our work better? That's a really difficult question that I can't just answer off the top of my head. I think it's probably unrealistic to think that the UN Security Council is going to do everything we say. We're just people making comments and trying to give the best assessment we can give. And so it doesn't, break my heart when they don't listen to us. But I think that this more regional approach would be really useful. Rather than just looking at Liberia on its own. And they do that. I mean, the Security Council are very smart people. And they do think of it that way. But I think that, the more that can be done, the better. I'll think about it some more and I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, just quickly on Orrin's questions. There's a lot of openness, certainly from the President and the senior members of her cabinet, for innovative sort of private sector solutions. There are two constraints, I think. One is just there aren't that many people at that senior level who can deal with all the very many problems out there. So the extent to which they can think through on urban transport or on restaurants or hotels or a whole range of other things to come up with these innovative solutions is a little bit limited. And they've looked to some extent to the donor community for advisors and advice. And a lot of the consultants that come in have the same old ideas of, well, this is the way it's done in every other country. So I think while there's an openness to do that, because of capacity constraints, there aren't as many innovative ideas, I think, as there is the potential for. Second, in terms of getting the private sector investment going, it's very risky still. And it depends on the investment. But frankly, when you've got the 13,000 UN troops and they have to leave, and that raises questions about the security after that, a lot of private sector people, you need to make your profits pretty quickly given the high risk environment. So that a lot of private sector folks are willing to take that risk. But I think what that means is that I think there is going to have to be a fair amount of public sector investment in the next 2 years because the private sector environment remains so risky. That doesn't mean only, and I think there's a lot of potential for private sector investment, and Mittal's coming in, and so I'm not at all saying this should be public sector driven, but I am just saying we need to recognize that from a private point of view, the risks remain high, and so you're going to see that I think curtailing some of the investment on GMAP. It's a great experiment for those of you who aren't familiar with this. GMAP is the Governance and Economic Management Assistance Program, which was signed with between the donors and the NTGL back September of last year. So it was before President Sirleaf was elected, before they knew she was going to be elected, and partly it was a bit of insurance against who was going to be elected. and things were quite bad. Corruption was quite bad. It has a couple of components. One is that 7 expatriate advisors are given co-signing authority for financial transactions in 7 different places, at the central bank, at the Bureau of the Budget, and 5 different state-owned enterprises. So you've actually got the Liberian controller or person with financial responsibility that signs off, but also an expatriate who also sits there and signs off. It does provide some control in the short term. It does make it a lot harder for things to disappear, but it also raises a lot of other issues about trust and about capacity building. There's a second component to GMAP, which is supposed to be capacity building and technical assistance. It hasn't really happened much. The donors have been much slower, actually, to provide that component of it. But it is a bit of an experiment in what some people called shared sovereignty. So far, I think it's worked reasonably well, and I think that the President has appreciated at least not having to worry about those particular places, but with big caveats and worries that she has. She's not all that comfortable with this, and I think would like to see Liberia get to a point where they can phase out of that process relatively quickly.
Jasper, the last word.
I just add, I mean, on the GMAP side, it's been a little, I mean, it's a bit like the curate's egg, and it varies, and it's good in some parts and not so good in other parts, and it's been disappointing in lands and mines particularly, in as much as the individual who was supplied by GMAP for the ministry spent very little time there, and there was a lot of leave, and then there was sick leave, and then he resigned a couple of weeks ago. So in fact, nothing has actually happened yet. So we're sort of 6 months down the road, and we're still kind of, you know, waiting for the reviews to take place now, and the technical assistance. So, you know, it varies. It's never kind of it seemed to lack some degree of coordination, I think, in that respect.
Okay, well, welcome me, help me in thanking this very, very good panel. Thank you very much for coming.
Good